billion Jamaican dollars, represents one of the largest securities frauds in a security dealer since the Financial Services Commission came into existence nearly 23 years ago, 22 to be exact. It is an alarming amount that shocked the soul of Jamaica. In addition, the anger and unease we all feel have been magnified by the long duration, 13 years, over which this fraud was allegedly perpetrated. And the fact that the perpetrator or perpetrators seem to have deliberately and heartlessly targeted elderly persons, as well as our much beloved national icon, Ambassador Usain Bolt. Furthermore, the coverage of this fraud in every major media outlet across the globe is a source of great embarrassment to Jamaicans here and in the diaspora. I feel the full range of emotions: anger, disgust, hurt, and like many Jamaicans, I am deeply pained by these events. This is a body blow to Jamaica and has the unfortunate impact of tarnishing Jamaica's global reputation. And I'm extremely saddened by this. I feel the pain of those who have lost resources on which they were dependent. Over the past 30 years, Jamaica has successively failed to successfully arrest and prosecute persons who were allegedly criminally responsible during the FinSAC era, neither those criminally responsible for Cash Plus and Olint, Worldwise, and other such schemes. Similarly, persons allegedly responsible for public sector frauds over much of this period have similarly escaped punishment, regularly meted out to others. With that as our historical context, the SSL fraud has touched especially raw nerves, a nerve that represents the reservoir of distrust that has developed based on what many believe to be the historical Jamaican experience of one law for some and another law for others. A nerve that captures the wells of suspicion that white-collar crimes are processed and treated differently from other crimes. A nerve that characterizes the deep pool of cynicism in our country, where there is sometimes a belief that the real truth is artificially suppressed and nothing ever really changes. These waters of distrust, suspicion, and cynicism are existential threats to our society. It will take time to drain the system of these, but we must begin now. This time must be different. Let me repeat what I have said and what the most honorable Prime Minister has said. There will be full transparency in this matter. No stone will be left unturned. The investigative authorities have full operational independence and will pursue the facts wherever they may lead. They will unearth exactly how funds were allegedly stolen, who benefited from such theft, and who organized and collaborated in this. The probe will also seek to identify whether assets have been acquired with the proceeds of this fraud, whether here in Jamaica or overseas. If and when such assets are identified, all legal steps will be taken to restrain these assets with the intention of full forfeiture. Having spoken with some of those leading the investigation I can say that they are resolute and determined to unravel its complexities and bring all responsible to justice. In fact, based on the magnitude of this fraud and the lines of inquiry being pursued, the Financial Investigations Division and the Fraud Squad have already, last week, sought assistance from the Federal Bureau of Investigations, the FBI, and other international partners. Ladies and gentlemen, despite this most unfortunate development, Jamaica's financial sector remains strong. There are, within the financial sector, we have the banking sector, the securities dealer sector, pensions, insurance, among other operations. Within the security dealer world, there are 38 licensed security dealers operating in Jamaica. Security dealers, according to information from the FSC, had assets under management that exceeded $1.4 trillion as at September 30th of 2022. The assets managed by SSL in all represented a little over 2% of the total assets under management by security dealers. This does not minimize anyone's loss. As I said earlier, this fraud is one of the largest securities frauds in the last 2 decades. The market share information I shared a while ago simply places SSL's demise into a national context. SSL was a relatively small securities dealer, and its problems do not pose a systemic risk to the financial system. There is therefore no need to panic. The financial sector is strong and well capitalized. The financial sector survived the global financial crisis. It survived 2 debt exchanges. It survived the COVID-19 economic shock, the inflation crisis, and it even managed to grow through all of this. Not only is the financial sector strong, it is also resilient. More specifically, the securities dealers industry remains a strong and critical pillar upon which our country, our economy, and our investing public depend. We as a country require a strong and stable and credible securities dealers industry that is ready to operate not only in Jamaica, but on a regional level and an international level to move our country forward. Now, the Financial Services Commission has a board of commissioners appointed by the minister and an executive director appointed by the commission responsible for day-to-day affairs. It is operationally independent in supervisory and regulatory matters, which is the way it was set up, and it is the way we want it to be. You do not want elected officials making prudential nor regulatory decisions. Let me state categorically that in approximately 5 years of service as Minister of Finance and the Public Service, neither the FSC Board of Commissioners nor the FSC Executive Director nor any person from the FSC has ever raised Stocks and Securities Limited, SSL, with me in any way. Furthermore, however, in fulfillment of our commitment to transparency in this matter and acting under Section 68, 1A subparagraph C of the Financial Services Commission Act, the FSC will release the regulatory chronology of SSL for the time period of this fraud from 2010 to 2023. it will release this chronology to the public. However, we should not allow this account from the FSC to distract us from the fact that managers and directors of securities firms have a duty of care to their company and to their clients. And this duty of care is independent of regulatory agencies. The managers and directors cannot be exonerated from that duty of care. They must account for their stewardship of SSL. Furthermore, please recall that the FSC relies on the reports of external auditors and the reports of management of licensees. For example, if an external audit records a balance as an asset on an audited balance sheet, this generally means that the balance ought to be collectible. The chronology of FSC's regulatory action with SSL for much of the 13 years between 2010 and 2023, let me repeat that. The regulatory chronology of FSC's interaction with SSL for the 13 years between 2010 and 2023, which coincides with the period of the alleged fraud, will show that SSL was under regulatory scrutiny for much of this period. SSL was under directions from the FSC for the period 2010 to 2013. SSL was under amended directions from the FSC from the period 2013 to the end of August of 2017. SSL was again placed under directions during the period October of 2019 all the way through to the end of 2022. Those directions were never lifted, following the results of an on-site examination in 2019. SSL was placed on additional directions when the fraud became evident in 2023. I asked for the chronology of regulatory actions, and that is what the summary shows. For 10 of the past 13 years, as I mentioned, SSL has been on the directions. Further to the general directions of that period of time, the Board of Commissioners voted to issue a notice of suspension, the most severe sanction, in November of 2016. The media has covered that there was an opportunity to be heard in February of 2017, and the board of the FSC made the decision to accept an undertaking, a board undertaking from SSL to implement specific measures to correct identified deficiencies, which is a legitimate regulatory action prescribed in law, meaning board undertaking is one of the regulatory and supervisory mechanisms that are mentioned in the regulations. SSL was put on enhanced monitoring in June of 2022. Now, an objective review of the chronology of regulatory activity over these 13 years, spanning 3 political administrations, 4 executive directors, Rowan Barnett, Leon Anderson, Janice Holness, and Everton McFarlane, and at least 5 chairpersons, may they rest in peace, from Emile George in 2010, followed by Colin Bullock, who chaired for 4 years between 2012-13 all the way to 2015-16, may they rest in peace, followed by Howard Mitchell in 2016-17, Jackie Stewart-Leckler in 2017 to 2021, and John Robinson from 2021 to the present time. Over this entire period, this alleged fraud was being perpetrated. And the information available suggests through the affidavit that that is the case. And other information that has become available suggests that others who have been defrauded, who do not appear on that affidavit, that the theft of their resources would have begun from as early as possibly 2012 or 2013 or thereabouts. Over this time period, as the FSC discovered breaches, the record suggests that it gave the entity concerned directions and followed up to ensure that those directions were followed and implemented, which for the most part they were. This was not a JLP approach or a PNP approach. This was not Emile George's approach or Colin Bullock's approach or Howard Mitchell's approach or Jackie Stewart Leckler's approach or John Robinson's approach. This was an institutional approach. The evidence suggests that it was a consistent institutional approach throughout the 13 years of FSC's regulatory scrutiny to prefer to work with the entity on identified weaknesses with very specific corrective actions that they were called upon to make. The central issue, my fellow Jamaicans, is how did this fraud go this alleged fraud go undetected for 13 years between 2010 and 2023, perhaps even longer, with external auditors, regulators, managers, bankers, and later internal auditors. How did this fraud go undetected for 13 years? I put it to you that that is the central question, and it is a question that our government will ensure is answered. I ask for us not to be divided at this time by narrow ambitions, but to focus on the central issue that across 3 political administrations, 5 chairmen of the FSC, 4 executive directors, 13 years, a massive fraud was being committed at SSL, and it went undetected. And I repeat, this government will get, through its investigative bodies that operate independently, the investigative authorities will get to the bottom of it. Today, I will write to our international partners who have traditionally provided support to the Financial Investigations Division and other law enforcement agencies to specifically request the assistance of international forensic auditors to help unravel this 13-year fraud so we can bring to justice all perpetrators and all co-conspirators. And the fraud could have begun prior to 2010. It may not be limited to 13 years. Now, this 13-year fraud has provided a window into how fragile financial sector confidence can be. While Jamaica has engaged in enhancing our financial sector regulatory environment, which is much stronger today than a decade ago, there is clearly more work to do. In our letter to the Managing Director of IMF that we agreed to in December of 2022, following the staff-level agreement on the precautionary liquidity line and the Resilience and Sustainability Fund, we advised the fund of reforms in the financial sector that we have been pursuing to strengthen stability and sustainability, and further committed to achieve those reforms within specific timeframes. These include a special resolution regime law to strengthen the resolution of non-viable financial institutions while protecting financial stability and the public funds in line with fund staff recommendations. And we've committed to a date of March 2024 to submit this law to Parliament. It also includes a methodology via the BOJ consultation paper to identify systemically important bank and non-bank financial institutions, and we have committed to a date of September 2023 to submit this to Parliament. It also includes the establishment of supervision by the Financial Services Commission of financial conglomerates without deposit-taking institutions, and we've committed to September 2023 to have this done. We, like you, have an ambition to be a vibrant, prosperous country with a strong financial sector. We have the largest and most dynamic stock market in the English-speaking Caribbean. We have the largest and most dynamic bond market in the English-speaking Caribbean. And while we don't have an offshore financial sector like some Caribbean countries, we certainly have the most developed capital markets, I would dare say, in Central America and the Caribbean. These are achievements that we hope to build on. Strong capital markets can play a pivotal role in development. And for our capital markets to achieve its potential, confidence in its safety and soundness is vital. Furthermore, for our society to strengthen in peace, unity, and cohesion, fairness, equity, and justice must be manifestly present everywhere, including in our capital markets. We as a country operate in a complex, interconnected, global financial market. For us to attain and maintain the position of a trusted counterpart to international business, we must strengthen all of our abilities to identify, investigate, and prosecute financial crimes in the banking, securities, insurance, pensions sector. As such, we'll be working not just with the regulators, but also with the Financial Investigations Division of law enforcement to ensure that the best human and technological resources are in place and persons play their role in protecting not only our investing public, but all Jamaicans. To take the Jamaican financial sector to the next level, the government of Jamaica will review the penalty regimes in the Securities Act, the Banking Act, the Insurance Act, and the Pensions Act. We will stiffen the penalties for white-collar crime in the financial sector. The discrepancy between the sanctions for white-collar crime and other forms of crime must be erased. If you rob depositors or you defraud investors, our society, and you put our financial system and our way of life at risk, the Jamaican society wants you put away for a long time. A long, long time. The government of Jamaica will also require security dealers to publish their financial statements and material events at standards equivalent to public companies on the Jamaica Stock Exchange. The government of Jamaica will tighten regulations around connected party transactions for security dealers. The government will introduce a fixed penalty regime where companies can be fined for AML, CFT, and other breaches. And if they fine and if they don't pay, they go to court. What we have now is that authorities have to take companies through the court process, and only then can a fine be imposed. This will improve the sanctions regime and the speed with which sanctions can be applied, and the difference in time between when an act is allegedly committed and when a sanction is delivered will be greatly shortened with a fixed penalty regime. The government will tighten regulations around insider trading and ensure that the penalty and sanctions regime is severe and dissuasive. The government will tighten regulations in such a manner that ensures that the penalty and sanctions regime against front-running of clients in capital markets is severe and dissuasive. We will require technical assistance from our international partners in the design of these reforms and in advising us of additional reforms that may be necessary. Now, the institutional arrangements and approach of the Financial Services Commission that I described over these past 13 years and probably before, and that have been highlighted by this particular case in question, cannot take us into the future. An institutional approach of seeking to work with institutions over a long period of time, rehabilitation, is an approach that cannot take us into the future. Last week, I had a discussion with the outgoing executive director that we needed to pursue a new direction at the FSC, and I would need him to make way for that. Without hesitation, he concurred and agreed to provide his resignation with terms of his exit from his 3-year contract that would ordinarily have expired in July of 2023. So as not to distract from the substance of today, I plan later this week to disclose the terms of his exit, possibly by tomorrow, which hew closely to what he's contractually entitled given the circumstances of his exit. Executive directors of the FSC earn large amounts, certainly compared to ministers of government. And he's on a fixed-term contract, and there are contractual obligations for terminations that fall outside of the termination options available to us with the speed with which we needed this vacancy to be created. As I announced last Thursday, and which will be formalized by the incoming commission, and of course we had to move quickly to communicate the direction of the regulation of the non-DTI sector. Mr. Karen Burrell, I'm sorry, my error. Mr. Karen Burrell, Major Karen Burrell, Chief Prudential Officer at the Bank of Jamaica, will succeed Mr. Everton McFarlane as Executive Director of the FSC. Furthermore, there are 4 members of the current Board of Commissioners who have volunteered to provide the vacancies that allow me to make the following appointments to the Board of the FSC, which will be effective today. Mr. Richard Biles, Governor of the Bank of Jamaica, will be Chairman of the Board of the FSC. He will be joined on the Board of the FSC by Mr. Wayne Robinson, Senior Deputy Governor of the Bank of Jamaica, Mr. G.D. Lewis, Deputy Governor of the Bank of Jamaica in charge of supervision, Mr. George Roper, Deputy Governor of the Bank of Jamaica in charge of finance, technology, and administration, and a former Deputy Executive Director of the FSC. And another person who I'm not yet prepared to name. I do not believe in the complete turnover of boards, as institutional memory is lost. Furthermore, that practice no longer accords with existing regulation. As such, the board commissioners who remain are Mr. Irwin Burton, former Deputy CEO of Grace Kennedy, Mr. Dennis Brown, retired partner of PwC, Ms. Kenesha Davis, attorney at law, and Mrs. Hillary Robertson, senior director at the BOJ, on secondment to the Ministry of Finance and an advisor in my office. The immediate responsibilities of the new board, in addition to what customarily applies, are to, one, oversee the current intervention in SSL. There's a temporary manager in place. Establish a mechanism to review FSC's approach to the SSL case in order to identify any gaps or constraints, and to assess the status of other licensees and whether there are concerns or potential concerns in respect of any company in the securities industry, just for absolute completeness. And as I mentioned earlier, the FSC will release a chronology of the supervisory action or activity with respect to SSL over the period of the alleged fraud, 2010 to 2023. Now, my fellow Jamaicans, the institutional structure of regulation in a country should reflect the structure of the industry that it is called upon to regulate. With the intention of supporting the continued growth of the financial sector while preserving the safety and soundness of the financial system, we need a regulatory structure that is appropriate for our circumstances and that is responsive to our needs. It is a reality, it is our reality, that in Jamaica, groups that include deposit-taking institutions account for close to 90% of financial system assets. To put it another way, the Jamaican financial landscape is characterized by a number of financial conglomerates spanning banking, securities, insurance, and pension that account for all but 10% of financial system assets. Against that reality, fragmented supervision can lead to regulatory gaps in a landscape such as ours, where financial conglomerates dominate. In addition, there's often duplication of effort, duplicate oversight, and sometimes coordination challenges. The natural institutional silos that emerge detract from the nimbleness needed to comprehensively regulate financial groups. The government of Jamaica will therefore pursue a unification of prudential supervision and regulation. The prudential supervision and regulation of deposit-taking financial institutions, commercial banks, which are commercial banks, billing societies, merchant banks, credit unions, which are currently supervised by the BOJ, and non-bank financial institutions, which are security dealers, insurance companies, and pension funds, will be consolidated into one institution, the Bank of Jamaica, and a separate regulator will be given the responsibility for market conduct and consumer protection for the full spectrum of financial services. Market conduct and consumer protection regulation refers to the oversight of financial institutions to ensure that they're engaging in fair and ethical practices and are treating customers fairly. This includes monitoring compliance with laws and regulations related to consumer protection, anti-money laundering, and anti-fraud measures. It also includes monitoring the sales and marketing practices of financial institutions to ensure that they're not engaging in deceptive or misleading conduct. The goal of market conduct regulation is to protect consumers and maintain the integrity of the financial marketplace. Today, Jamaica has a sector-by-sector regulatory approach where the BOJ regulates deposit-taking institutions, FSC regulates non-bank financial institutions, and market conduct regulation is similarly split between the two. As a result, you often hear the cry in the Jamaican public for greater, more effective market conduct and consumer protection regulation of the financial services sector. As a result, this regulatory model which we will pursue, which is known as a Twin Peaks regulatory model, will have the prudential mandate of the FSC with respect to the non-deposit taking financial institutions to have that mandate fully taken over by the BOJ. And the new FSC would become a highly visible market conduct and consumer protection supervision, not for a part of the financial sector, but for the entire financial sector. Deposit-taking institutions, banks, billing societies, etc., non-bank financial institutions, cambios, remittance agencies. While some of the issues outlined earlier in having sectorally focused regulators, a regulator focused on one subsector of the financial space and another on another, can be resolved through close coordination and cooperation by these sectoral supervisors through memoranda of understanding and statutory committees. An integrated single prudential supervisor will be in a much better position to address them, especially in the Jamaican landscape, where 90% of system assets are controlled by financial conglomerates. In particular, coordination and exchange of information will be smoother within one institution, as well as the effort to close any existing regulatory gaps within the regime. The implementation of a single prudential regulator for deposit-taking institutions and non-bank financial institutions has several advantages. A single authority would provide much needed economies of scale in supervision. The entities to be supervised have created for themselves economies of scale. The regulators must do so as well. A single authority would allow for sharing of specialist knowledge across the supervisory spectrum. It would help preserve scarce management resources. A single authority would facilitate delivery of a much needed system-wide oversight and effective supervision. It would help promote a consistent, harmonized framework of regulatory requirements where applicable and of supervisory methodology, reducing regulatory arbitrage opportunities and regulatory gaps. And a single authority would generate cost savings relative to current arrangements where there is duplication of efforts in many areas. More significantly, it would create options for more effective organization of resources. It would facilitate risk-based allocation of staff to emerging supervisory risks and different approaches to conglomerate supervision. These could include, for example, the creation of a single team for one or more groups, maximizing the synergies from the integrated model. Coordination of supervisory work would also be greatly facilitated. The service that would be provided to customers could also be greatly enhanced from these economies of scale and from the synergies that would be derived from this framework. It would also, very importantly, create a richer, a more dynamic scope for employees of the supervisory authority, allowing for the development and sharing of expertise while offering more challenging career paths for supervisory staff. The proposed integration of prudential activities of the FSC into the BOJ involves three components: an interim management component, a legal and government reform component, and then the institutional restructuring and change management. In the first stage, the regulatory responsibilities for the BOJ and the FSC will continue to run in parallel initially, while the framework for a merger of the responsibilities is worked through. And the composition of the new board that I announced today and the management that I have announced last week, that composition is designed to facilitate the integration process. We are about to access the PLL and RSF from the fund, and over the next 18 months, it is envisioned that the BOJ and FSC will probably continue to operate separately, but with integrated management. We will obtain technical assistance from multilateral partners and international consultants on the implementation of this framework. We will determine and draft the required amendments to the required legislation, including the Financial Services Commission Act, the Bank of Jamaica Act, among other legislation and institutional governance reforms. And then we'll have to do an undertaking of an organizational review of the FSC and departments at the BOJ to inform the new structure and staffing arrangements. The current work on the draft bill for financial service consumer protection continues, incorporating the new direction with regard to consumer protection with a view that a reformed FSC would take on this role. We will need, as I mentioned earlier, technical advice and time to consult with industry participants on the details. But we fully expect to be in a position to implement a unified financial sector regulator and a separate market conduct consumer protection regulator for the financial sector in the next 18 to 24 months. Now, even with an upgrading of the regulatory structure to reflect Jamaica's industry, Jamaica needs to continuously and sustainably strengthen and renew its regulatory and supervisory capacity. Regulatory staff are of the kind of competence that are usually in demand in the private sector as well. A given, and that will not ever change. As a result, we have to invest in our own capacity building and generation of supervisory talent. The BOJ currently has a range of international partnerships that provide training. Under a unified prudential regulator for the financial services sector, there will be significant economies of scale to expand and formalize some of these training partnerships such that the consolidated supervisor would be able to create its own staff training college, not a physical college, but a mechanism for the constant training and upgrading of supervisory and prudential regulators. Ladies and gentlemen, these are indeed times where we find ourselves feeling anxious. But I have provided in my remarks our securities dealer sector remains strong and vibrant. The government of Jamaica is determined to support investigative authorities in getting to the bottom of this alleged fraud over at least 13 years and to ensure that all perpetrators and co-conspirators are held to account. But we must learn from this occurrence and ensure that we put in place an environment that can allow our financial sector to continue to grow and develop and to be able to compete not only locally but regionally and internationally. The government will remain resolute in the strengthening of the regulatory environment with the measures I have shared today and the disposition and attitude and principle of transparency in this matter will govern all that we do. Again, I ask that we not pursue divisive strategies at this time. This particular incident spanned a long period of time, and the central question is, how could this pilferage from customers at SSL happen in 2010, 2011, allegedly, 12, 13, 2014, 2015, 2016, 2017, 2018, allegedly, and possibly 2019, 2020, 21, 2022, with the full array of external auditors, internal auditors, management, board, bankers, regulator, with it going undetected. I assure you, on behalf of the government of Jamaica, that with the international help that we have already requested in the case of the FBI, and that we will request in the case of external forensic auditors, we will support the investigative authorities to unravel every aspect of this fraud. Ladies and gentlemen, there's a proverb that I'm going to just paraphrase that says that in moments like these, we can seize them for the opportunities they provide, or we can choose to succumb to despair. With the agenda that I've laid out today, the government is decidedly seeking to embrace the opportunity for reform in a most comprehensive way to ensure that confidence in our financial system can flourish and grow, and Jamaica and all Jamaicans can benefit from the fruits of economic progress long into the future. Thank you, ladies and gentlemen.
Thank you, Dr. Clarke. At this time, the Minister is prepared to take brief questions from the media. All we ask is that you wait to be identified, and our hostess will present you with the microphone.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Minister. There's a couple of questions here. You said in your presentation, Minister, that I'm sorry, Edmund Campbell from the Gleaner Company. You said in your presentation that no one from the FSC has raised the SSL issue with you in any way at all. Question is, based on information or interactions, I suppose, that you would have had with FSC, has the FSC raised any issue or concern with either your immediate predecessor or any other finance minister from the period of time in which these issues arose? My second question to you, Minister, is has the FSC or any other public body, to your knowledge, have they invested in SSL? And in the case of the FSC, could you give us an idea what's the extent of that investment? And if, in fact, they have invested in SSL, could you give us your opinion on the question of a conflict of interest, clearly, that would have arisen in this particular case?
Right. The first, okay, I remember now. Previous finance ministers can speak for themselves, but in the interest of transparency, I will relay that I had a conversation with former Minister of Finance, Audley Shaw, today, and asked if I could share the results of that conversation with you. And he has told me that during his tenure, the matter of SSL was never raised with him by the board of FSC nor by anyone from the FSC. That's what I was told by former Minister Audley Shaw. With respect to your second question, whether the right, I have asked that question of the outgoing executive director, and he has, in no uncertain terms, said to me that, to the best of his knowledge, that's certainly not the case, and has not been the case during the course of his stewardship. No, you're talking about FSC having investment in SSL. And with respect to public bodies, I emailed the temporary manager, who obviously is an appointee of the FSC and reports to the FSC, and asked that question about public bodies and I want to share with you the response that I got, if I can find it. The response that I got from the temporary manager installed at SSL is that the following public bodies have balances with SSL. The National Health Fund has a balance of approximately $740 million, $740,563,020. The National Housing Trust has a balance of $238,855,480. The National Insurance Fund has a balance of $8,400,730. The Jamaica Agricultural Society has a balance of $8,958,646, and the Jamaica Banana Industry Catastrophe Fund has a balance of $98,285. Again, this is the information that has been provided to me by the temporary manager of SSL.
Minister, Fitzroy Prendergast, Caribbean Business Exchange. I wondered, there has been a tremendous effort from the financial sector to get non-banking persons to get involved in banking. We as persons in the industry understand the ramifications and that the fraud on the scale of Jamaica's economy is relatively small. However, I wonder if you could give me your impression as to how this will significantly affect those small folks who were reticent from the beginning to say, getting involved with banks and so on. And how do you get them to have confidence after this debacle?
Thank you for that question. The nature of this fraud is such that it represents a tremendous setback to Jamaica, and it represents a setback to the Jamaican financial sector for the reasons that you have identified. We have a large non-bank sector, large non-bank population who have various reasons for being outside of the banking system, but some of it, lack of convenience, some of it, feeling of not being welcome, some of it, for reasons that you mentioned. The strategy that we've been pursuing will continue, which is a strategy of making banking more accessible to all Jamaicans. We recently amended the POCA Act to allow for accounts below a de minimis threshold to be opened with less stringent KYC requirements. And that threshold, I know people are watching internationally, so it's important I mention, that threshold is approximately 200,000 Jamaican dollars, which is just about $1,300 US. And that, making the process more customer friendly, we hope will serve some purpose. But the central bank has also introduced a digital currency that holds a prospect of increasing the efficiency of the banking and financial services experiences for Jamaicans. And we are, frankly speaking, we are engaged in deep regulatory reform. That's going to be a continuous activity. Just last year, 2021, we brought the microcredit sector under the supervision of the BOJ and introduced a lot of market conduct requirements of that sector, where predatory lending in that case, false marketing, and so forth are offenses under that act for which there sanctions can be applied. So it's a process of ensuring that access to the financial system is easier, more efficient, more accessible, cheaper, and also ensuring that regulation provides appropriate and dissuasive sanctions for reckless, unethical, or criminal behavior.
Afternoon, Minister. Neville Graham from Gleaner Business. Just 3 questions and a follow-up to my brother's question. You describe the position of SSL as being relatively infinitesimal as regarding the rest of the financial sector. What then is your comment on the potential, definitive comment, on the potential for contagion, given the interrelated nature of the financial system? The second question, given the length of time that that SSL could have been viewed as a problem institution, why was the license not suspended? Have you asked that question, and did you get an answer? And thirdly, the bodies that have deposits and so on with, not deposits, but money invested with these institutions, quite significant numbers, Minister. Have any of these institutions been affected by the shenanigans at SSL?
Any of the, what is the last one?
Institutions.
Okay.
The investments, have they been affected? Are they safe?
So first of all, my disclosure of SSL's market share should not be perceived as a dismissive comment or a comment where I'm seeking to reduce the magnitude of this event. It is necessary to put SSL into context within the financial sector. And within that context, SSL's market share at just over 2% measured by assets under management is such that it does not represent in any way a systemic threat. And I think that was the nature of your question. I'm just repeating that. It does not in any way. It doesn't have the kinds of interrelations and so forth that would present a systemic threat. It's predominantly the assets that I'm referring to. Well, let's leave it there for the moment. I didn't get the last part of your question.
The length of time that the problem persisted and...
oh, why? Yes, okay.
Why?
So remember, I am here giving an account over a long period of time, a period most of which I wouldn't have served as ministers. I'm providing you with a chronology prepared for me by the FSC. Over the 13-year period, there was one time when there was a notice, the issuance of a notice to suspend, and that was in November of 2016. And I already shared with you that what transpired, as the documentation supports and suggests, is that SSL had exercised its contractual right to be heard by a panel made up of the commissioners a panel of commissioners from the FSC. And this is already in the public domain. You really want me to answer? It's already in the public domain. It's on the front page of one newspaper this morning. So I don't really need to. Let's get a question that's not, if you don't mind.
Bodies that have investments, are they affected?
Oh, right. The statement, so I have read from a printout from the SSL system of the balance on record at SSL on behalf of these entities. The assets under management by SSL were at various points audited. So I would have to think that these balances on the system mean that the funds, that these balances are not at risk. You understand what I'm saying? But I can't speak definitively to that. The nature of the fraud seemed to have been a fabrication of client statements. So the system would say one thing, but the client would end up with a statement that said something else. So here I'm not quoting from what the customer got. I'm quoting from what is on the system as provided by the temporary manager.
So you're not ruling out the possibility that these numbers may be wrong, Minister?
At this point in time, I can't rule, I mean, I would never rule anything out, but I said on a balance of probabilities, given that this is what the statement has, and there is audit statements that have a total amount of funds that are still there, that are still held by SSL. The balance of probabilities is that these are not at risk. But it would be unfair to expect me to speak definitively to that at this time. But on the balance, if you give me, I could make a call to the temporary manager and give you a more definitive response. But I wouldn't. This is from, I want to make a difference. This is from the statement, the printout from SSL. As the nature of the fraud is that the client got one thing when the system said something else. And the fraud seems to have been specifically targeted at, a specific sets of persons. It seems, that's an early indication, but obviously this investigation is clearly at a very early stage still.
Okay, Minister, Andrea Chisholm from TVJ. 3 quick questions. Are you able to say whether the stolen money from SSL was insured? You mentioned that, and these are my words, you asked Mr. McFarlane to step aside. Was it because of the press conference or the overall management of the FSC? And the final question, you mentioned this new regulator for market conduct and consumer protection. Will you be empowering that regulator to publish what I may term problem institutions to the public so that consumers can make informed decisions?
All right, those are 3 heavy questions. Give me them one at a time, please. Give me the first
Minister.
one first.
Were the funds that SSL insured, the defrauded money?
All right. On the, I believe it was on the 10th of January at 7:30 p.m., SSL provided to the FSC its audited financials for the financial year ending June 30th, 2022. At approximately 8 p.m. on January the 10th, 2022, SSL provided by email a letter advising the FSC of an incidence of fraud at the company, and a copy of that letter that I have seen, SSL claimed to have fraud insurance to the tune of $1 million US. That is what has been, I can't, that is what they have claimed in a letter to the FSC. Please do not take that as something that I have not independently verified that. Okay? But in the interest, again, of just telling you what I know, that is the spirit in which I'm engaging with you.
Okay, Minister, thank you. The second question was about asking the FSC Executive Director to, my words, step aside. Was this because of the press conference or the overall management of the FSC?
Yeah. Okay. A review of this sort of 13-year period, as I tell you, over multiple sort of administrations and so on, the FSC needs to move in a new direction and needs to move to a place where a change in executive director is just absolutely necessary. It's abundantly clear that change needs to take place. The press conference, the press conference by FSC was, Mr. McFarlane wasn't left covered in glory at the end of it. And again, just to give you my transparent views, but the overarching is that the direction of the FSC and what the FSC needs to do in this next phase of its life, leadership, needed to be renewed.
Okay, Minister. And the third question was about empowering this new regulator to publish data on problem institutions so that consumers can make informed decisions.
So there's nothing in the law that prevents FSC from doing it now. And I believe there was a time when the FSC sort of used to, and I believe as agreement with the industry, a long time ago they stopped. The FSC always has to balance. The FSC always has to balance, interests, and there was there's jurisprudence that that suggests that very clearly sets out the FSC is under no obligation to do that, but it's not a simple matter as it may seem, but it's a very legitimate question, because where it is clear that concerns can be addressed and there is confidence that they will be addressed, and if addressed, the entity can continue to provide service, then I don't think only in Jamaica, but in other parts of the world, rather than risk instability, the preference often is to work with the institution. But that is something that, the will of the Jamaican people is what we will abide by. If that is what the Jamaican people want, then that's what we will do. But one has to give very, very careful consideration. I don't think that could be a blanket statement. I don't think you could do that. I think you have to leave the FSC with the discretion.
All right. At this time, we'll be taking our last question.
Good afternoon, Minister. Javin McLean from CVM Television. Earlier you mentioned that there will be stiffer penalties for persons who are, caught up in fraud or, attached to a scandal such as this. Can you provide a timeline in which these penalties may take effect? And also, as finance minister, amid the whole, in recent years, we're seeing a lot of fraud with financial institutions. Are you concerned or worried as minister, how this may reflect, how this may reflect Jamaica on an international scale?
Right. So I am concerned, but I also sort of recognize that the publication of instances of fraud can also be a reflection of a rapid improvement in detection mechanisms. And so things that may have passed in the past are being caught and exposed. That's certainly a very plausible interpretation. Look, there are good and bad people all around the world, in every country in the world, and there's no law, regulation that you can put up that can prevent or stop, people from pursuing dishonest actions in any sector, but let's say in the financial sector. One of the hazards of the colonial experience is that we tend to nationalize individual acts of indiscretion. In European countries, in North America, individual actions of discretion is the individual. They did it. Not the United States, it's not Germany, or it's not the UK, it's not. So a part of our national self-confidence has to be, and that's why the way in which we deal with this is so important. A part of building our national self-confidence is learning to attribute individual responsibility and not always seek to nationalize and to socialize infractions. Those who are those who are perpetrators and collaborators, they're the ones who are, and are not fall victim to the myth that is something about us. That's not true. There are good and bad and very bad people everywhere. That doesn't now take anything away from all the reforms I mentioned that we must do to improve our system and to increase penalties and so forth. But let's not nationalize this.
Mr. One quick final question. The Auditor General in her annual report indicated that she has done a special audit of FSC and that she has submitted her draft report to the parent ministry, I suspect, as well as FSC. The Financial Secretary and yourself would have had sight of that report by now, I suspect. What are your thoughts on what the Auditor General has raised in her special audit of FSC?
Okay. I'm aware that the Auditor General has issued a draft report to the management of the FSC. I have not seen a copy of it. I've been briefed on some of its contents. And look, it is what it is. We're transparent about everything. The management has an opportunity to respond to the Auditor General. I think there are differences of opinion on a few matters. But once the management responds and the Auditor General has the opportunity to consider the management's response, the report will be tabled. And, I guess one of the things that the new management will have to do is to provide an account. That wouldn't have been a result of their stewardship, clearly. And, whatever the identified deficiencies are, if they indeed are deficiencies, they'll have to be addressed.
Minister, two questions, Minister. The first one is quite simple. Based on what you've said today, do you believe that the FSC failed in its oversight of SSL? And the second question is tied to the first one. The former executive director, Mr. Everton McFarlane, was at his press conference and he stated that his agency was regulatorily up to the task and well-resourced. Based on what you said today,
Thank you, Shaban. I mean, I would say that the FSE took a consistent approach certainly over the 13-year period of working with this entity to resolve its deficiencies. That's an institutional approach that I think needs to change, and members of the securities industry are going to have to get used to that, of something closer to a zero tolerance approach. But it's a institutional, in my view, it's an institutional issue. When you look at the chronology, it's very clear over a long period of time. It's finding infractions, putting them on the directions, following up to see if they're implementing those directions, and then a new thing arises. Put them on directions again, follow up, etc., etc. The exposure of that approach, I think the conclusion of the public, which coincides with my own, is that that's not a recommended approach or sustainable. That's an approach that may have worked when the industry was at 50 billion in size, but at 1.45 trillion, no way. The nature has to change. And let's leave it at that. I mean, we do have institutional deficiencies as well, right? In how the FSC is making prudential decisions, right? Making prudential decisions. That the law calls for people with banking, legal, accounting, finance expertise, and any other expertise that the minister thinks is necessary. I've always thought prudential experience is necessary. When it came to my time to appoint, I got somebody from the Cayman Monetary Authority, which has assets much bigger than ours. I got a couple of people from the BOJ and so forth. So there a balanced approach, in my view, or a balanced assessment over the entire period that we're looking at, 2010 to 2023, would say that the institutional approach to the regulation of this sector, where it seems if you're almost needs to change. But that is not to suggest, that we have SSL is 2% of the sector. The security sector is strong. We have players who abide by the rules, who do the right thing, and who are not. In fact, so I don't want that to be generalized in any way. Okay, David wanted to ask that for a long time. Let's take it and then. I can't hear you. We need a delayed mic for you, David. We need a 10-second delay.
All right, no problem. So, although my colleague mentioned the resource consideration earlier, and the shifted integrated management and approach and so forth, is that there is need to push more resources, or consider increase the fees at the agency to allow it to do a better job in its new role, because there's a general concern that the FSC didn't have the capacity in terms of human capacity to truly effectively regulate the sector, as evidenced by the reference to the 2018 AML report, where there are only 4 AML officers for the entire securities and insurance industry. And just the other question, will there be a change that the public can speak on? Because while I understand the need for technocrats and other members of the Securities Dealer Association to speak on matters, it really would be good if there would be some input from the public, especially where there are gaps that might not be readily noticed by others in the sector.
On the second question, absolutely. Our process for this kind of reform, we would have wide consultation With respect to resources, what I mentioned is we want to put in place a regulatory structure that can generate its own resources. We can't be forever dependent on overseas resources coming in. We have to generate our own capacity. By having economies of scale of a single unified regulator, the new regulator will have the economies of scale to create, with assistance from international partners, to create its own staff training, I use the word college advisedly, but staff training, right, where we can generate our own supervisory and prudential talent. Ladies and gentlemen, I think I've hopefully lived up, well, I have shared with you from my heart and from what I know, and I'll continue as the situation unfolds, make myself available to the public on this and other matters. Thank you.
Thank you, Minister Clarke. Thank you, ladies and gentlemen, members of the media. At this time, we've come to an end. Enjoy the rest of your day.